Welcome to your favorite YouTube channel, Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name is Ed Piscor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
Today we're going to be taking a look at MOEBIUS Redux, A Life in Pictures. This is a BBC4 documentary. You can find it floating around online on YouTube if you type in search of MOEBIUS. But first, you guys must know that we are a daily YouTube channel with more than 1,600 videos at your disposal. Good chance we might have talked about your favorite comics. Certainly probably talked about some of your favorite MOEBIUS comics. So hit the magnifying glass on the front page of the Cartoonist Kayfabe YouTube channel, search for your favorite titles, check out those episodes. We are also sponsored in part by our Patreon, and the King Kayfabers on our Patreon get access to all of our videos before anybody else. Mitigates the kayfabe effect because they get first dibs on the stuff that we talk about, and they're hanging out with us in a live stream recording session, chat room. They're watching us record this thing unedited, which may be a treat, may not be a treat. We'll leave it to them to decide. But there is a lot of perks to being a King Kayfaber, and please consider supporting the channel that way. Without further ado, Jimmy, let's talk about MOEBIUS Redux, A Life in Pictures. BBS documentary, 2006, I believe, is the time period that this thing was created. And it's a beautiful time for it to be created because MOEBIUS is still with us. During the making of this documentary, I'm assuming that he was the president of Angoulême.
That was my impression too, because we get some footage from Angoulême and him being celebrated there. Although I imagine he was celebrated anytime he showed up at Angoulême.
Totally.
But yeah, I have a feeling that that's the case. The president.
We got a very vital and functioning Jodorowsky in that flick. We have vital and functioning Stan Lee in that document. We have a vital and functioning. Well, we have a functioning H.R. Giger. In that piece, and also Dan O'Bannon, who is very sort of worse for the wear. He looks very sickly when they're talking to him, but he's still very cogent and stuff. You could just tell that like he's just not healthy. Do give him props though, cigarette in hand. It's like fuck it, you know what I'm saying, man.
Droulet also features quite a bit.
Oh, if we're talking about just who's featuring, tons of people. We got Droulet, Enki Bilal makes a little cameo appearance. Jim Lee, Mike Mignola. Who else? Is that about it?
It is. I was trying to think if there were any Hollywood directors or somebody of that nature, and Dan O'Bannon is probably the main guy from Hollywood with Hollywood connections, and I guess Jodorowsky to some extent as a filmmaker.
Yeah. So let's jump right into things, man. It starts off with like a computer, Arzac, Intel kind of introduction, and it makes me appreciate MOEBIUS even more. Because with all of the technology at the disposal of whoever put that together, you really see the beauty of, like, there's very little depth, even though you see, like, far cityscapes and stuff like that. Of course, it's very cheaply presented. It looks more like 1980s computer animation. Think the Crash Dummies cartoon or, like, Tron or something like that.
Yeah, and, for the most part, this is a straightforward documentary. It goes in chronological order, which I think is a good way to present an artist who has all kinds of different stuff. But it's got to be the biggest misstep on the part of the filmmakers is that opening animation.
Right.
It's such a disservice to MOEBIUS. It's literally burying the lead.
Totally.
You've got one of the greatest visual artists, period, and we're going to start with some kind of pretty hack CGI kind of animation. But don't let that stop you from checking out this documentary because that goes by quickly, and then we get into the great stuff.
Totally. Like you said, it's pretty linear, so you get his sort of early years, art school years. We get to see a lot of footage of him drawing, and like one of the things that I like a lot is they definitely have like the little record button on the Cintiq while he's drawing things, but also Mignola and Jim Lee.
Yes,
where you see them at the board drawing some things, man, and then you get to see it kind of animated, which is pretty freaking fun.
Yeah, it made me wonder, like with the Cintiqs, like when does that become? Some of those guys might have been drawing on that Cintiq for the first time. Because that's pretty early, 2006, 2000. It's probably, I don't know exactly when this is recorded, but it may be a couple years before, even a year or so after. But that's still pretty early for a Cintiq.
Yeah, he seems like he'd be a seeker, like a guy who would play with different tools if he had the opportunity to just see what he could pull out of it, man. It's that old thing that we talk about where it's like the tool isn't the thing, man. It's the guy who's wielding that little stylus.
Yeah, and with somebody like MOEBIUS, the tool really isn't the thing. You know, I've imagined that guy could make magic with anything.
But seeing him draw some of those pieces with the dip pen that was a sight to frickin' behold. I could have watched 5,000 hours of just that. It's a kayfabed setup, in as much as like the inkwell is on over top of the drawing, like say at 11 o'clock. And you just can't imagine that he's going to be reaching over with like the potentiality of like dropping a dab of ink on your stuff. You put it over to the side. If you're left-handed, put it to the left. If you're right, put it to the right. But so like the setup was a little bit kayfabed, and that kind of stuff is unfortunate to me, because I want to see the like what's the real deal. You know, like you see Drew Lier in his space. It's a beautiful space. Like there is, like how would you put it? It's a big open space with like maybe like a 30-foot ceiling, but there's a second floor, so you could stand on the second floor, and there's like guardrails and stuff, and you like shoot the camera down and see Drew Lier with a big giant piece of paper using like straight edges to create one of his compositions that with the symmetry, but he has a cigarette in hand, so like seeing that ash get bigger and stuff, that was making me nervous.
It also his space is filled, like every flat surface is covered. Drew Lier, we're talking about. That was fascinating to me, where he's like drawing on top of other stuff, it even looked like.
Yeah.
So that may have been a little bit kayfabe, but boy, did his space resemble when I think of his artwork as being like every inch filled with marks. Reflective of his studio setup, at least in the footage that we see there.
Yeah, for sure, man.
That's the thing with a documentary like this, is you've got to have the guy drawing. You have to, you know, like, especially now, like if it's somebody that's older and maybe there's just no footage of it, you're stuck with what you're stuck with. But if the guy's still alive and vibrant, it's like you got to get some footage of drawing, and they do that. And that's one of those things, you know, if you're checking off what makes this a good documentary or not, you can check that off. There's some drawing, you know, you get to see some drawing in here.
Get into the humble upbringings, art school, excelling at art school, yada yada. Sells his first work at age 14, 15.
Mm-hmm.
And he recognizes, like, how cool was that? You know, he said, and they show some of that stuff. And I was actually studying it really close, man. I was pausing on those parts, because what they show is stuff that would have been black and white. And it was like these cartoony Western tales. And like working in black and white right now, like I'm very conscious of that, to try to figure out how to separate shapes, because you don't have the benefits of color to separate foreground, middle ground, background. And that's something I'm still working on, still kind of struggling with, because I always had extra tools. It's like the project I'm working on now, it's the first time where I want to like not have that kind of safety net and just like really try to figure stuff out. So seeing at that level, him working was pretty freaking awesome.
MOEBIUS is an interesting guy to study for that, because like, you know, in my head it's like I think of guys like a Mike Mignola, but he's using big black areas, and MOEBIUS is using a lot of line art. It's a very different way of like, how do you create depth with just line art and maybe a little bit of hatching or a little bit of these extra marks. So interesting artist to study for depth, because it's something he's very, very good at.
Totally. It was a revelation that, like, say around his like third year of art school, his mom divorces his dad or whatever, marries a Mexican fella, and they go off to Mexico. So MOEBIUS decides to kind of stop his educational pursuits, goes to Mexico, and when they show the broad vistas and things, and it juxtaposed with his artwork, it all makes sense.
Yeah, for some reason I was not aware that he had spent like a year in Mexico at a formative time. And yes, whatever he was learning at art school, I feel like that time spent in Mexico, right up there with the quality of whatever he was getting out of the art school experience, because it did totally jive with the artwork that I associate with him. Those landscapes and things, man, the footage that they juxtaposed, and again, good on the filmmakers, right? Yeah. They're talking about his art style and Mexico's influence, and the stuff they're showing from Mexican landscapes fits right in. So pretty good piece there, but also something I just didn't know about him.
Totally.
And it kind of makes sense too that then the connection later in life with Jodorowsky, I can't help but think there's some crossover as a result.
Right, and of course that's the time where they get Jodorowsky in there to sort of comment on those little bits and pieces. They showed some stuff from his Blueberry work at that point when they were talking about the landscapes, and it was an interesting shot, because usually you think of like the vast, like you see the horizon line and the kind of vast expanse that MOEBIUS is able to convey, but they showed a top-down view, and it would be like, say, like a train or something on some tracks, like shooting down at, you know, a plateau or like one of these weird structures. and so much minute detail in that line art. It made me think of Jeff, because it was like would be all these like little rock formations that are so minuscule, so minute, but like totally thought about and considered.
Yeah, they early on in the doc, they kind of established that Moebius is almost like multiple people in terms of his art style. And I think Blueberry is one of those where you really see a divide from like some of his science fiction, more fantastic stuff. So they do try to, I don't know about explain, but they do try to make that point that it's almost like he's kind of embodied a few different artists over the years and goes back and forth between these different artists that live within him.
The things that this is missing the doc is missing is some of the sort of chemical pursuits that he's taken, because with the surrealism of the sci-fi stuff, it doesn't look like the work of a straight person. Like, I don't see Steve Ditko or Kirby being able to like hit these kind of visionary images. I think you got to have your third eye opened.
That's interesting, man. I'm with you for the most part there, except I think those two examples are the toughest ones to do, because they do weird stuff.
They do, but it's square. Like it's weird the way Klaus's patience is weird. Like you can tell there's a constipated vision to what they're doing. And the guys who, like, when I went to art school, to a man, I could fucking identify like, okay, this dude fucks with acid, this dude fucks with acid, and I was 100% right. So like there's some extra thing. It's kind of like when we play that game and it's like here's the art style. Like, people who mess around with psychedelics and shit, they draw different.
Yeah.
And Moebius definitely pulls. So I would like to hear about that kind of shit, because then you would have the opportunity to have Joe Dorowski. Like, imagine that would be the first times you hear ayahuasca ever mentioned. All that kind of shit.
You know what? This is going to be a little bit of a tangent. One of my last notes on here is about Crumb.
Right.
And seeing certain parallels between Crumb and Moebius, and the big one is the timelines. So early on, Moebius makes this comment about his standing in comics is due to a new kind of reader, the result of social upheaval. So this is getting into the 60s, right? Like Blueberry, I think, starts in maybe 63, which also is a connection to like Marvel Universe, to give you context of what's happening in comics globally or historically, and that's pretty fascinating. But so much pop culture, the 60s is that time of like radical change. And I haven't heard this idea of like social upheaval and a new reader emerging. I've never heard it, I don't think, in conjunction with American comics, even though like the underground comics start to show up in the mid to late 60s. And then, of course, that is a different reader. So I saw some real parallels there, and that's a road I wish they would have gone down further, because, like, again, I don't hear people... I don't hear Frank Miller talk about how in the 60s different readers suddenly showed up.
Right.
And, it may be the case that did happen, or maybe in the 80s different readers showed up in American comics, but that concept of like a new reader showed up, and then it was like, well, what do we do for them?
Right.
Moebius, the way this documentary puts it, it's kind of like his work, and especially the stuff that he was doing as Moebius, would have serviced this new reader. Where'd that new reader come from? Who else is observing that and benefiting from it or creating work for it? And I find that concept really interesting, because it's not one I've heard discussed within comics, and I'm not discounting it.
Yeah.
I think there may be some real validity to it based on just the way pop culture evolves in the 60s, and most of my filter of 1960s is viewed through American pop culture. So it's interesting to think, like, is this a global phenomena? Like, and it probably was.
Yeah.
It probably was. So I thought all that was interesting and stuff that I really don't think about much whenever I think about Moebius or any of these comic artists. And it's like Moebius, Undergrounds, Marvel Comics appealing to college students. Like, there were a lot of these forces that were maybe changing the audience of comics in that decade.
It's real fascinating at the time, because the early part of that decade.
This video is brought to you by the comics that we make. Ed Piskor's Switchblade Shorties is now running as a daily comic strip on Instagram, Webtoons, Facebook, wherever you find your comics. Look for Switchblade Shorties. Ed also has Hip Hop Family Tree, the Omnibus, out in stores everywhere now, collecting all of the Hip Hop Family Tree strips, along with 150 extra pages, and available in diminishing quantities. So pick that one up if you haven't added it to your shelf. The next Red Room collection, Crypto Killers, is now out in stores. Completely self-contained, so if you haven't read Red Room before, Crypto Killers, perfect place to start. And X-Men Grand Design, the trilogy trade paperback, collecting all of the X-Men Grand Design in one trade paperback volume.
my Grand Design, Hulk Grand Design, is coming to the trade paperback format, and you can pre-order this one now. The Hulk Grand Design Treasury out of print. So if your store still has a copy and you don't, pick it up. But if you missed it, there's a trade paperback coming. I've been self-publishing lately. True Crime Funnies, my nonfiction collection. BW, celebrating the black and white indie comics of the 80s and 90s. And the 1986 zine, celebrating the greatest year in comics history, are available at jimrugg.com or patreon.com/jimrugg. And my latest books, Street Angel Princess of Poverty and Street Angel Deadliest Girl Alive, collecting all of my Homeless Ninja on a Skateboard superhero comics in 2 handsome volumes from Image Comics. And now back to our video.
Pilat magazine comes up. That's where Blueberry shows up. And there is a comic called Spyro, that like whenever you're in France, whenever you're in Europe, you just see this little fucker everywhere. He's super popular everywhere but the United States. So I get the way that they were selling it, and forgive me for being ignorant of this, but the way that it seemed that they were selling it was like the guy who makes Spyro was the writer of Blueberry. Did you get that? Because like Moebius is saying it like, oh, you know, I love your work, blah blah blah. That's the magazine where Spyro's showing up now, and then like let's work on a because there is a writer for Blueberry. Yeah. So is he the writer?
I don't know. I kind of glossed over that part, possibly.
But long tradition in pop culture of like other cultures embracing the American Western.
Right.
Spaghetti Western, it's Italy. Garth Ennis comes to mind with his interest in the West. And because Stan Lee is quoted as saying something like, who would have thought a Frenchman would, how can he be French making these Western books?
Yes, Stanley basically coming in contact with Blueberry and being shocked to learn that it's a French artist, but recognizing the quality of them. Yeah, he also says something like he met his deadlines. You know, part of maintaining that series or that series' success. That's some of what he attributes to it. Which, man, I've looked at a lot of those books. There's a lot more to them than meeting deadlines.
Oh, totally. And what's fascinating is that they don't do the artist any favors. But he talks about like, yeah, it was so successful that Blueberry continues, and they show some more modern Blueberry stuff, and it's fine, it's okay. But it ain't Moebius, and it is evident.
Yeah.
That you could tell on the screen that it's not him. But, you know, when we talk about, so making deadlines, right, that's jobber talk. And we've established that the work it is not jobber work. But he was feeling the jobber grind when he's like, I feel like I'm at war inside. You know, like I have this burning desire to do this other thing, but this is paying the bills. I need this other vector to get these other ideas out. And then that's when he starts moonlighting as doing the Moebius thing. And it turns out that there are guys like Drulier and like 2 other dudes.
Bilal.
Yeah, and I guess maybe
Deone. I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Right.
Boinnet. Those are the 4 that come up in this documentary. And I wrote this down because he's talking about the work that he was aiming for and then starting to do as these guys get together and that, you know, that clash against whatever the traditional was,
right,
and wanting to do something new. These are the words that I think Moebius says in the documentary: transgressive, subversive, surreal, avant-garde, bizarre sci-fi. I just think it's a different conversation these guys are having about art making and comics compared to the conversations that were happening historically here at that time. It's so funny too to think of those, because I come to Moebius late 80s, you know, probably when Epic is probably come across like an Epic reprint. Maybe that Silver Surfer Moebius book would have been one of my early Moebius comics. And whatever revolution those guys enacted with Metal Hurlant, it's in the past for me. You know what I mean? Like in my mind, they're not transgressive and subversive. They are just awesome.
Right.
But it's interesting to think like to get to that point of being awesome or being available, they did have to like kick down some barriers, and that would have been done in the 70s, maybe the mid 70s. I think Metal Hurlant 1974. You know, so around that time, they're really pushing the boundaries and trying to do something else with comics. 15 years later, you take it for granted because that mark has been made, and then, you know, a generation has been following in those footsteps. So kind of normal to me in 1989, but in 1974, it's like this is some new stuff.
It's a fascinating notion, right? Because like these are people who sort of, he talks about growing up reading Spiro, right? So in the same way that the Americans were reading, their Walt Kelly and their Karl Barkses and so, which was kid stuff, then you get a Robert Crumb who might play with that style but push it in very subversive directions, and then you have Moebius and his crew doing a version of that. They certainly have way more cultural stuff happening around them, which makes it lean in one direction or the other. Think even like French New Wave stuff, like you had to go to special theaters to be able to see that kind of stuff here. So and it is the French that coined the term ninth art. I think as comics is the ninth art, right? Which I think they recently said that video games are the 10th, which is an interesting thing. So it's just it's a much more like art based kind of culture. And they went in the direction that they did, and they said immediately, dudes are knocking on the door. How do I get in there? It would have been a tangent, and maybe this is something you could discover in some other written interviews. But I do wonder how Corbin fits into that, because it seems like he gets involved pretty early, and his style seems far too lush to be relegated to the undergrounds for his whole life, especially with what he can do with color and stuff, because he was playing with that color on the covers. So that's a curious tangent.
He talks about being in a translate state for some of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it makes me think of other artists who have talked that way. Like Alan Moore has kind of talked about the idea that we're almost radio, we're almost receiving these waves.
Right.
And it kind of reminds me of that whenever somebody says translate state, but it makes me think how does Corbin show up and look like he's perfectly in step with these guys, and yet he's doing it thousands of miles away
in the middle of nowhere
without the benefit of conversation. He's not calling these guys on the phone and they're talking about their new ideas, and yet whenever they show some of the Corbin covers from Meadow Orlant in this documentary, and it's they look perfectly in line with this stuff, and it adds to that idea of when ideas show up, they show up kind of everywhere. It's almost like the spot, you're seeing spots on the map light up as these ideas are suddenly finding reception. And it's Corbin was channeling the same. There's so much in common with that stuff, especially compared to the other stuff that would have been around Corbin at the time, where it's this is alien artwork compared to almost everything else that's happening, say in American comics.
Right.
But then you put it in the context of Meadow Orlant, and it's oh, they're simpatico. These guys are thinking similar thoughts, even though, their style's still different, but it makes sense. But it's just amazing to me that this is happening around the world.
100 Monkeys, man.
Yes. Yeah. It's weird because, again, that translate thing is not something that I hear in comics. Maybe little pockets of it. I think of, you mentioned Patience. Klaus, whenever he was doing a Velvet Glove Cast in Iron, would use his dreams a little bit. So, maybe that's a similar concept, where you're pulling ideas out of somewhere, but not necessarily the foreground of your consciousness.
Moebius, when he starts hitting with Metal Orlant, he cites 4 big books. There's 4 big works, and the first is that Destination one.
And we have a video of that.
Yeah.
So check that out if you're unfamiliar with that strip.
And it's a small strip. Maybe it even showed up in Pilot or someplace.
I think it did, and I think that's his first. He credits that as his first Moebius.
The shot across the bow, some new comics are here. So that's the first one. He cites Arzak, which probably showed up in the first Metal Orlant. In fact, the cover is that big monster from Heavy Metal 2 in America, which we have an episode of. And Airtight Garage. But then there's a 4th story that he mentions that the title escapes me. It's several words in French, but the image that they showed with that I didn't recognize. So it's man, is there a Moebius comic out there that I don't know? And he calls that the end of his ejaculation.
Yes, and that's when he splits from Droulet.
Right, Droulet, he's fun. There's a move that one can do, and I'll do it with Jim Forever, where Droulet is Moebius is older than me, and he'll say that the Moebius has some years on me, and it's just that's a great hedge to just say that I have more time, I have some more time to kind of catch up to that level, man. So and Droulet does that, he makes it a point to say that. So Moebius is a little older and stuff, and they break off and shit, which I guess, there's a back end business component to heavy metal, of course, because like when they talk about like quit working together and stuff, and it's like, it's a comic anthology. It's not like you putting your hands on each other's pages.
Yeah, I got the impression that they were more connected. And it's not that they're working on the same strips, but they may be meeting regularly and kind of talking philosophy on what they're making. Almost pushing each other through this ongoing conversation. And that makes sense to me because I often think like whenever we start hanging out, it really advances my ability to make comics. Having people that I can talk to or show something new
Absolutely.
to. And so that was my impression of what they're describing there. Like I think those guys, while not working on the same page, were working and maybe showing their work to each other and talking about it and doing new stuff, and both of them pushing in that new direction. So that was kind of how I took that. It was interesting. I mean, they make it a deal in the movie. Like it's a moment where it's like we split.
And it makes sense because like you always associate like Druillet is always the also ran. When you talk about those comics, French sci-fi, Moebius is number one always, and then Druillet like comes next, and like nobody wants to be Dave Mustaine, so like he's got some of that scar tissue that he exercises like on the camera and stuff, and it just talks about I have respect for him, but that's all like just I respect him, that's it, and that was like his swan song like on the documentary. But then we get to Hollywood, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And
Jodorowsky bringing him basically into the Hollywood machine via Dune, even though I guess they were doing that in France, and it falls apart. But it is hey, let's make a movie. You're a master of images. I want to see this movie in images.
If we would have seen this documentary when it came out, like if we were in the UK or something, we would have been hipped to Jodorowsky's Dune 10 years, 5 years before the big documentary came out. And that documentary, like, there will be a video on that at some point on the Kayfabe channel, because like that would be worth rewatching. And it's a video that I encourage like any of my creative friends who have not seen it to check it out. And the value of it really is in not being precious with your original singular idea if it goes up in smoke, because in that failure there is no Jodorowsky's Dune. There's David Lynch's Dune, and it sucks. And but what came from that, even Star Wars came from that. The way that they suggest, some of the fight scenes and stuff. Alien came from that. Blade Runner came from that. The creation of Cyberpunk came from that with Dan O'Bannon and Moebius doing their Long Tomorrow. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
We have several videos.
Yes, we do. Even with Jeff Darrow joins us on one of those. One of the giant influential comic strips. And that one's amazing to me because it's 14 pages maybe or something. It's shorter than a comic book length. And one of the most influential comics probably, of the time period.
Right. They only allude to it, and O'Bannon is cool on that thing, man. They don't show any of his roughs, unfortunately. It was the Kayfabers who sort of hipped us to that. But he provided roughs for the work, and he talked about like what Moebius would do is he curled the toes of that monster that's like on that dude's crotch, and he's like, just by curling the toes, you don't have to have a thought balloon in this panel. The toes say it all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fun, having him kind of weigh in on it. It's always neat to have like an artist talk about another artist because they have insight, and the respect that comes out of O'Bannon in terms of what Moebius does, how he elevates that material. Very fun. Totally.
And it was a function of O'Bannon, who was going to be tasked with doing the special effects, bringing the Giger artwork for Dune and bringing the Moebius artwork for Dune into practical effects. That was what he at least on the script that they showed. That was going to be his responsibility. He mentioned how fast Moebius was, which I heard from a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And he said Moebius was just tired of O'Bannon up his ass, basically, while they're working on this thing. Moebius is like, go write a comic for me. And then that's how that story comes along. He says I want to put it in my Metal Hurlant magazine. So I'm imagining that while Moebius is working on this, he's still keeping that going too.
Yeah,
Hard worker.
O'Bannon says that he basically goes away and then sees it, and I think he sees it in Heavy Metal. So they must have maybe published about simultaneously, but he kind of goes away and doesn't see the comic, doesn't see the finished comic, and then, sees it in print and very impressed by it.
Yeah.
So at that time, Moebius does go to Hollywood, works on Alien and Tron, and kind of talks about Hollywood and what it means to him. It's a real, I don't want to use the word validation, but Hollywood had such, I don't know, rule over our imaginations visually at that time. Think late 70s, early 80s. And Moebius is very respectful of Hollywood and its power. And, moves to LA whenever he gets a chance and works there. It's another chapter in his storied career. And it's fascinating to think about because I don't feel like we view Hollywood that way now. But at the time, I guess it's the only game in town. Like now people are shooting Academy Award nominated films on their phones.
Right.
You don't need the Southern California light or that industry now. And so I think the way we view it has changed. We've also seen behind the door quite a bit more maybe than you do back then. But very eager, it seemed, Moebius to go to Hollywood and participate in that machine.
Somebody in the chat is mentioning like one of the great quotes from Jodorowsky in the documentary was that he approached Moebius to do that artwork for the Dune project. Moebius was being wishy-washy, and Jodorowsky's like, I'll just get Juliet to do it then. And Moebius like, no, I'm on board. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's go, man.
Jodorowsky is a compelling figure. That dude has charisma at least when the camera's on him. I felt that way with the Dune, the Jodorowsky's Dune documentary, and I felt like it on this documentary too, man. He some Stan Lee-isms in there. Like I think he knows when that red light is on, and he goes into his performer mode. Or maybe he's always that way. But
it's cult leader Riz, man.
He's on whenever the camera's on for sure.
I would never want to meet him. I would never want to be caught up in the spell. I've heard firsthand stories about how he kind of can get you in the web and stuff. And he had his hooks in Moebius for many years. Like probably the bulk of Moebius pages have Jodorowsky's stamp on it.
That's interesting.
And it's the charisma, like that could certainly to like a self-effacing artist or an introverted kind of artist. Like he knows what to do and what to say. You could just see him on that screen, and he has the wonder words and shit.
Man, it's funny. You can almost see him as like dictator, cult leader. There's all these different positions where I feel like he would have excelled.
Yeah.
And we got him as storyteller, which is probly
lucky for everybody.
Yes.
Because
that works out well.
There might be a Jodo brand on a whole bunch of girls' butt cheeks or something like that, man. If he would have went in one direction or the other.
But it also reminds me, like whenever you'll see like someone who's violent or something, they almost can spot the other person that has that tendency.
Straight up. And
I feel like Jodorowsky's super creative, right? Just ideas going in every direction from his head, almost like kindred spirit whenever he bumps into Moebius, where it's like, oh, this is another one of these dudes that has the energy.
Yeah, what did he call them? Because like when he amassed this crew, it's a Voltron he made, and it was in the Jodorowsky documentary where he's like, my spiritual warriors.
There you go.
He called them, and like that's his his word for like not a jobber.
Well, he's a master linguist. Like using word spiritual warrior. Like that's something. I'd be like collaborator, or my artist or whatever, work for hire artist. He has that thing, that turn of phrase.
He explains it though, and not in this piece, but in the Dune piece, and it is about like you just ain't punching a fucking clock. You're putting your own personal vision, your own personal demons into the work, and it's clear you have your own kind of ideas and things. So like that's what he means by it. He defines it in the documentary. But yes, like so much of their work becomes comics because when Dune goes away, Jodorowsky is now becomes a comic writer for a big chunk of time in the 80s there, man.
I mean, still to this day, I think he continues to write comics. Must have been a medium that he found, pleasing.
Certainly cheaper than making flicks. That's for
probably
damn
a
sure.
lot easier too than convincing a crew and backers and producers, they say that the reason the Dune movie doesn't happen is they can't get the wide enough distribution in America,
right,
to justify the budget.
Yeah, it's interesting because like they
That
had
is-
them,
that
they had
is
them
interesting.
because they could have filmed it. Like he said, they had the money to make it, but in order to recoup anything, you need 1,000 theaters, and they couldn't get a guarantee of 1,000 theaters.
Yeah, it's wild. It's so interesting. Like I've never heard people quite describe a movie project in that way. Really interesting.
Right. And like that's the thing, like I've been watching a lot of stuff about the making of movies and things. And there's like there's a video called like the Hideki Anno problem where they go through all of Anno's career, and when they were talking about Nausicaa with Miyazaki, there was like a certain length and they wanted like a half-hour cutout because like you cut out that half hour, now it can play 8 times in a
Yeah.
day at a single theater. So like there's all those considerations that have to sort of be met.
I feel like Hollywood's done a good job of keeping that kind of talk out.
Right.
It's gotten through at this point. Everything's kind of transparent, but that was not a topic of conversation for like when I was in high school, for instance, and being reading everything you can behind the scenes on films or whatever you like.
Yeah.
it was pretty quiet.
Well, how's it work now where it's like fucking movies are 3 hours and what, they could play 3 times in a day on a screen?
It's a good question. I have no idea.
So the Hollywood stuff, to me, it's whatever. I've never seen Tron. Like all that I've ever seen of Tron is like the little bit that's on there, and I'm like, wow, that's some dated looking shit.
I watched Tron as an adult. Like I probably saw a little bit as a kid, whenever it played, but I didn't know what it was really. And I watched it in like 2002 or 2003 and enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So maybe worth a spin.
So now we get into American comics, and this is where the Stan Lee part, Jim Lee, and Mignola start to show up. It talks about meeting Stan Lee out there in Glittertown, and they're having what Moebius considers to be maybe just like a frivolous kind of conversation, just a little bit of frivolous chit chat.
Bump into each other at a party.
Oh yeah, like let's do something someday. And the way Moebius describes the French way of collaboration is you just forget about it.
Maybe in 6 months.
Laissez-faire.
Yes.
And like when talking to Darrow, it seems like everything is that way. Like if your gutters come down on your house, the guy who will fix it will be there in 3 weeks, maybe, and take several breaks and shit like that. The very next day, the script shows up on Moebius's doorstep. This is where they explain the Marvel method and how interested he was working in that format. Stan Lee called it a detailed outline. I do wonder how detailed it was. And the benefits for Moebius was being able to lay the story out graphically.
That's right.
Which he was very excited about.
Yeah, he explains it really clearly in a way that I think like we've lost something in comics,
Right.
with the hyper detailed script.
Yeah.
Because like where does the artist exist in that?
Right.
They become just an illustrator, and it does not take advantage of the medium and certainly doesn't allow you to shape the story graphically. So I thought that was kind of cool to hear that insight.
Totally.
Because that can be a bit of a throwaway comic, I think, if you're not cognizant of the conditions under which it was made. And it seems like Moebius was game, and took that plot and really like applied himself to it. They show some cool panels too in the documentary.
Right. And yeah, some good galactic shots and things. And this is where, Jim Lee is talking about the style, but more specifically, Mignola is talking about like seeing those pages come in, and is so hopeful about where American comics are going to kind of take their turn and things. And I guess Jim Lee's a part of this too, and it really just illustrates the sort of constipated nature of the Wednesday Warrior, because they spend minutes on just your casual comics fan, or not even casual, but like your voracious comics fan who uses that as a source of entertainment rather than like artistic medium, appreciation of an artistic medium. They do not want change. Jim Lee illustrates that even the change of a hairstyle will receive volleys of invective. So the audience really wasn't showing up for Silver Surfer, Parable. I could believe that a lot. Certainly running this channel and seeing some of the chatter that comes back, absolutely. And then Mignola was so excited that like, well, maybe now like we'll get some fresh work from the Europeans. We'll bring translations over.
Yeah.
I'll be able to read some of that stuff. They'll be within our system and create fresh new works. And Mignola's like, nothing happened.
Nothing.
Zero happened. Maybe they would have a guy come over, think about your. We have a video of this. Milo Manera doing his ex-woman book. He cites like the guys coming over doing Batman, and probably Batman Black and White was out at this point. And Mignola's just like probably the last thing he says is like, I've seen enough Batman. Like while it's interesting to see Katsuhiro Otomo do Batman, I've seen enough Batman.
Yeah. Jodorowsky weighs in on the Silver Surfer.
What's he say, Jimmy? And quote.
Well, I got two. One is Moebius is the artist, Stanley the businessman industry.
Right. Yeah, that's good.
Makes sense, but also it does illustrate, I think, that Marvel method and the potential of working that way. If you have an artist in the equation, you may get something special.
Right.
The other thing he says, and I have in quotes, Superman makes me vomit.
That's your quote?
That's my quote.
How about I shit on the United States? He says.
I feel like that's the same. Hates the superhero, though. And I think that's illustrative of a lot of the world. Like there's a real American ideology mixed in with the superhero concept. Alan Moore, I think, has written and talked extensively about this concept, and Jodorowsky just minces no words in his assessment.
As he's assessing it, he also uses the word religion around the superheroes, and I think that's what you can sort of use when talking about that Wednesday warrior who doesn't want the New 52 to exist because it obliterates their previous canon and shit. It obliterates their first testament of their religion, of their scripture. Then it gets into a little personal stuff, man. He has one family, divorces, gets a new bride, and I bring that up because it sort of is the end to the piece, but there's also more Jodorowsky talk, and he talks about the new wife is like, yeah, these cartoonist wives, man, they're all the same. They're very strong women because they're babies. Like what do artists do? Like they sit around and draw all day, so they're fucking children. They're in a childlike headspace, so they need a mother figure to kind of haggle with the contracts and stuff. And he was kind of not mocking her, but kind of like, you imagine kind of going over some of the conversations that he probably has had with her and had some frustrations. And we don't get much fucking Moebius work in America in translation. And I think that maybe some of those, you got to relax a little bit of that, maybe, man, because it is sad to not have like the primo Moebius works here in the States. Like whenever they were announcing the big Dark Horse bit, so stoked, right? We're getting Moebius again, and it's Adina, and it's colored in a computer, and it's kind of wonky and stuff. Get Arzak back on the fucking stands, man.
I mentioned this recently on an episode, and it's just what European stuff sells. Because that's the bottom line here. If they're not doing Moebius, it's because it's not meeting some sort of financial level that his caretakers expect or
exactly
require.
They're placing a value on it, and the value is not commensurate with what can come back from the American publishers.
Yeah, and like pretty much as long as I've liked comics, Moebius has been held in this super high regard. So if I would see a Moebius that I could afford, I'd go home with it. Everybody doesn't feel that way, and in fact, I would say the majority of American comics consumers don't feel that way, and it really does make me wonder, like, why that is, and then what are the top European successes here? Where do they rank? Is there something that is really successful enough that it can make it here, as a European import and generate the kind of revenue that a world-class artist expects?
I think some of that that you bring up, man, I feel like some of that is the Field of Dreams argument. The culture has been starved of his work for 3 decades before Dark Horse started putting out their stuff. They didn't put their best foot forward. The 4 books that he names as being his great fucking ejaculation, it's none of those.
Yeah, you'd think that would be the thing to start with.
Exactly. So like, if you build it, they will come. That's your Field of Dreams thing, right? So like, if it was there, I could make the argument, like, it's arresting imagery, man. Like, I didn't know Moebius from anybody. And when I saw Arzak, like, I saw the first heavy metal I picked up was issue 2, where he has that monster painted on the cover, and it's an effect. It's I guess it might be issue 1 of Metal Hurlant, because that's the first Arzak is in there too, you know, and when I saw that with no real, I could have bought any issue, because at Phantom they were all $5, even issue 1, because I think they kept them things just in print, or like they printed so many of them that like every issue was $5, and I'm like, I'm scooping this one up. If they would have had issue 3, I probably would have left with that one. And what I'm saying is that the imagery is so arresting, with no baggage of anything. I had nobody to talk to. I had no fandom feelings or anything. I'm just like, what is this? This is coming home with me. And then seeing it and just being mind blown. 2.5, 3 decades worth of readers didn't get the opportunity to have their mind blown in that way. If they did, they went online, and I bet you, if I fire up the old torrents and stuff and type his name in, I bet you there's a lot of people seeing his comics in a bootleg space. So they're out there. It's just like they haven't given it a shot in decades. So like the audience needs to be primed a little bit. So
it's that thing too where the books would go out of print. Like I think of the Marvel Epic Moebius stuff, and the prices would just shoot up. So they may not have sold that well, but then once they get out of print, it's like the people that want it badly.
Right.
But maybe that number, it's not X-Men reader numbers or manga reader numbers or whatever. The last piece that I have from the documentary is there's a lot of talk about ego, identity, kind of a psychoanalysis. That's my writing that, it's not quoting, on the part of Moebius, and kind of talking about this art making. And that is what brought me back to the Crumb part. Mm-hmm. The one quote is, puts all his energy into his drawings, Moebius.
Right.
But it reminds me so much of Crumb, and their timelines are so similar, and it does feel like both of them kind of brought a new comics style to the page, to the audience, and new audiences. Right. That underground audience is a different audience than what you were getting on newsstands in America, and Moebius alludes to the different audience. So I kind of find it fascinating that those two have a certain amount of parallel between the two of them, and I wonder like if they've crossed paths. Great drawers tend to admire one another's work.
Right.
So I would expect that those two have probably looked at each other's drawings and comics with some, batting their eyelashes at those beautiful drawings. And it just makes me wonder if there's some stuff on record of those two crossing paths somewhere, talking about one another's work at all. Because it does seem like Moebius, has super French influence and everything that brings with it, and Crumb having kind of the Americana in his background. But there still feels like there's a lot of crossover in terms of what they're bringing to the page and the subtext of what they're bringing to their drawings.
Yeah, I want to direct people to when I was in Japan with Jeff Darrow, we were taking a look at a couple of Taiyo Matsumoto monographs. Jeff is a person we know who was closest with Moebius, like first-hand accounts and things. And when we were looking through the Matsumoto art books, 100 and 101 were the titles of the art books, we got to some of the parts of the book that look like he was woodshedding some, I guess maybe number 5 pieces, which is the Matsumoto kind of homage to Moebius kind of image making. And Jeff, we talk about the crosshatch and stuff, and Jeff was like, I always felt that that Moebius got the crosshatch stuff like from Crumb, like he said it. And it's a very different approach. It's clearly his own hand and stuff, but that's one degree of separation, talking about this stuff. And it is interesting because there is a Mount Rushmore of like world cartoonists, and it's like Moebius, it's Crumb, and I do put Otomo on that as well. And there were those Otomo. There's one Tankobon with one story that has a paste up of Fritz the Cat behind the characters as they're talking. And it's clear it's Robert Crumb work, so like these guys, they know each other. It's got to be. Think about like who can Neil deGrasse Tyson like really have a conversation with, It's a very small amount of people, right. And I feel like artists of that stripe, like who can they really talk to? Like they could talk to, any old person who makes a comic, on a very superficial level, but I do feel like those guys are pulling from a different set of tools that maybe only they can sort of navigate. But that said, it could be a Jack Kirby, Alex Toth conversation.
Very much so. The common thing there is just it feels like it all starts from the drawing. And certainly not every comic is built that way. Not every cartoonist is built that way. But in the case of Moebius, it really feels like again and again in that documentary, it goes back to that. It's just about the drawing.
Highly recommend the documentary. It's something that, man, I've been trying to like carve the time to see, and I had to kind of manipulate my profession in order to check it out, man. Like I could feel productive if we make it an episode. Here it is. Check it out. I'll even let's make sure that we put a link in the description below so that people can click and check it out. I got a lot out of seeing it. I probably shouldn't have watched it late at night as I watched it, because it just made me want to fucking draw. I wanted to get back at it. Very inspirational. There are lots of pieces, obviously, that are in French, so it's something that you have to sit and watch when Moebius starts talking, which was sort of one of the reasons why I haven't seen it in such a long time, or ever. So keep that in mind. You can't be casual. It can't be background music unless you're bilingual.
Hey, and I'll add this too. We talk about gratitude.
Yeah.
Very grateful to live in a time period where like I can stay at home and just do a search and watch this video.
Absolutely.
Like what a rich time.
Yeah.
Like I said, when I was a kid, you would buy whatever Moebius you crossed your path because it was so hard to find any of it. And now, you can watch this during your lunch hour from pretty much anywhere on Earth.
Absolutely, man. You good to go, Jimmy?
Yes.
Kayfabers, like, follow, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the bell so that we can notify you when new videos are available, and we are en route to having 100,000 subscribers. It would mean a lot if you subscribe to the vids and get us up to that goal. The channel is brought to you by many things, including the Patreon. King Kayfabers on the Patreon get access to all of our videos before anybody else. They're hanging out with us in a live stream recording chat room right now as we make these episodes. And because they get everything before anybody else, they're able to buy the comics that we talk about before anybody else in Gen Pop gets access to these vids and these comics. Ultimately, the videos are brought to you by the books that we make. You don't buy our books, we can't make any videos. Jimmy, let the people know what you have out in stores now.
I've been self-publishing lately, so I have True Crime Funnies, my nonfiction anthology featuring crime and wrestling. I've also been making zines, the BW zine celebrating the 80s and 90s self-publishing and indie comics, the 1986 zine celebrating the greatest year in comics history. These are available at jimrugg.com or patreon.com/jimrugg. My Grand Design, Hulk Grand Design, is available as a treasury edition, but this is sold out. So if your store doesn't have a copy, you're probably out of luck. But there is a trade paperback coming in May that you can pre-order now, the Hulk Grand Design trade paperback. And my latest releases, Street Angel Princess of Poverty and Street Angel Deadliest Girl Alive, featuring the homeless ninja on a skateboard. From Image Comics, you can get these wherever books are bought and sold, and perfect for the superhero fan in your life.
The Switchblade Shorties comic strip is coming to you on a daily basis. I have a directory, an archive at Webtoon for Switchblade Shorties, but if you're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, you'll be able to get your hands on all of the comics on a daily basis. The Hip Hop Family Tree Omnibus is out in the wild right now in very, very limited supply. 150 pages of material that is new specifically for this book. So it's the ultimate volume of Hip Hop Family Tree. Get it while supplies last. Thank you very much for supporting it the way you have been. Red Room Crypto Killers is the new round of Red Room comics that is out. What happened?
I was going to flip through it, and then I remembered YouTube doesn't like us flipping through this book, Ed.
Right, man. It is the new round of Red Room Comics, Murder on the Dark Web for Fun and Profit. Think Black Mirror meets EC Comics in a way. 4 stories in there. You can start with this comic, or you can start with any of them, because all stories are self-contained in each volume. And finally, the X-Men Grand Design Trilogy trade paperback is out there in the wild, collecting all of my X-Men Grand Design works. Some of those volumes are out of print, so it's your way to get all of my X-Men Grand Design in one handy-dandy soft cover edition. Like I said up front, you got to buy the books in order for us to kind of keep the lights on in the studio. YouTube don't pay nothing. But there are some ways to directly support the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel. Jimmy, let the people know what those are.
You can subscribe to the Cartoonist Kayfabe e-newsletter at the links below this video. You can also buy Cartoonist Kayfabe t-shirts, merchandise, mugs, hats, stickers, and more at our spread shop. That link is also under this video.
All good ways to support the channel. Give them those final marching orders, Jimmy, and we'll be on our way.
Read more comics.